Welcome everybody. I'm Dave Smith. You haven't figured that out yet. Very happy to be here. I want to thank Patrick and Chris and Randy and all of the people who have an Oklahoma City Dharma Collective, which I don't know if you realize it, but a lot of work goes into trying to get these events organized. So it's really nice when people find the time to make the arrangements, to do all the logistics and so on and so forth. So thank you for getting it together to have me come down and teach. We'll be here tonight from 7 to 9, tomorrow 10 to 4, and Sunday 10 to 2. So we have a lot of chances to practice together. So welcome everybody here. One of the things that I like to do actually, because I don't necessarily know who's in the room, so I like to play this little game. But before we do that, why don't we just sit for 5 minutes or so, just so we can kind of unhook from whatever it is that you seem to be hooked into. Let's sit for 5 minutes and do a short practice. Thank you for that. Can everybody hear me speak okay? Am I loud enough in the back? I've never been accused of being too quiet. I think it's going to start now. We'll do some more practice later. I just wanted to kind of do that. I feel more here. So, Mike, a couple questions for you. You can just show your hands. How many of you are here because you've become interested in mindfulness as a practice, and it's something that you cultivate and consider yourself to some degree a person who practices mindfulness? How many of you are here because you feel even further that mindfulness is part of your practice, but feel more familiar or accustomed to Buddhism or Dharma practice? How many of you are here because you consider yourself to be in some form of recovery in any way, shape, or form? Is there anybody here who has a clinical practice where you work with people with mental health or substance abuse or anything of that nature? Anybody here with a clinical background? Anybody here just because you're interested and you really actually have no idea what we're going to do? Fair enough. So I guess I'll start with the topic for the evening, which is a very important topic for everybody, regardless of what your background is or what your practice is really this idea of, and this is a public lecture that I've given in Buddhist context and also just in secular context. I've given this lecture at the University of Psychiatry at the state of Utah, and just lots of different places, public libraries, treatment centers, and addiction conferences. And it's really this idea that, start off by just saying this, that to some degree, as a culture and as a society, we have declared a kind of war against emotion. We've declared a war against unpleasant emotions. We've declared a war against unpleasant mind states. Really, any internal thing that we experience as human beings that's hard or difficult, we've kind of declared a war against that in the form of pathologizing everything. So if I'm having a bad feeling, there's a diagnostic manual called the DSM-5 that basically categorizes every unpleasant mental state one can have. The pharmacology industry is not the multi-billion-dollar industry that it is because of this dilemma. And what underlines this is this kind of cultural idea that if I'm having some kind of psychological or emotional struggle, that I'm doing something wrong and that I need to be fixed. And there's something wrong with me. And then we feel guilty about that, or we feel ashamed about that, or we feel like we don't want anybody else to know about that. So then we isolate into our experience, and we kind of can get trapped into this view that there's something about me that's just not working right, and I'm a problem. And somebody who's, I have worked in mental health, I've worked in substance abuse, I've worked in incarceration populations, I've worked with people in very, very, very different places, in rooms not quite as nice as this one. And one thing that I've noticed, and also I teach meditation retreats and Dharma retreats, one thing that I've noticed that I believe is that in all of this, what I'm talking about, the culprit in the room is an emotion. Is that as human beings, we have emotions, and we don't like feeling some of the emotions that we feel. And we feel as though there's something that could be done, whether it's medication or meditation or any type of thing, that if we could figure it out, that somehow we could actually we could be above all that, which is really, really not going to happen. And so we kind of get ourselves into this, what I call the war on emotion. And so part of the reason I want to talk about this is I want to talk about emotion from a science perspective. I want to talk about the practice of mindfulness as a really kind of vehicle, a practice on how we can better understand and work with our emotional experience. And also really from the Buddhist perspective, that there's a whole philosophical way of living that we can engage in, so that way we can have really a healthy emotional life, I think is sort of the goal. Is that we don't want to get rid of our emotions, but we want to have a healthy emotional life. And to some degree, we just actually have no idea how to do that. And it blows my mind, that when I look at the world I live in, I look at the advances that we've made in medicine, in technology, and the fact that we made this, but you can't tell me what to do when I feel sad. I actually can't believe that that's totally how it is. And I think that, and the reason why I'm most interested in this, actually, from a personal point of view, is that if I go back through my life, which I do more than I would like to admit, I mean, I also am somebody who has, I'll say a little bit about myself, is that I've been practicing Buddhist meditation and Dharma practice for 25 years. But even before that, going back till I was about 10, I actually have a fairly extensive history of complex trauma. So traumatic events have kind of haunted me for the last 25 years, and they've been reoccurring. As a result of having complex trauma, now I thought I just had PTSD, but it turns out I have complex trauma. PTSD would be an upgrade for me. That is, I think, for me, I believe it's the catalyst for my addiction. I'm also in recovery, and many of you know that. I have a long battle with substance abuse, drug and alcohol addiction, which I believe is totally directly tied to my trauma. I've also done a lot of work in the 12 steps, which has been very helpful. I've also done a lot of work in clinical work. I've done a lot of therapy, personal therapy. I've done a lot of trauma therapy, somatic experience, EMDR. I've sort of done everything you can get your hands on. I think this whole open-mindedness thing, I might have taken it a little too far. But I say all that to one thing that I've certainly deduced in my recent years and my recent training and work in what's called cultivating emotional balance, and really integrating science and Dharma as a kind of way of operating, which I think is kind of what American Buddhism has become. Because we have these great contemplative practices from the Buddhist tradition, and we actually as a culture know so much about psychology and about science and the science of emotion, that actually bridging the two together is a really beautiful mix. In having done all of that kind of work, one thing that I've become very clear about is, for sure, without a doubt, I can say that the nature of my suffering is emotion. That when I really suffer, emotion is always part of the problem. It's always the culprit. That my suffering seems to be driven by an emotional kind of engine. And when I learned this, I was very relieved, because I actually believed, and I don't think this is uncommon, that actually there was something just kind of wrong with me. That I know everybody struggles and everybody suffers and everybody's having a hard time. And, I get that kind of worldview. But I did believe that actually I got sort of a little bit of the shit end of the stick in all of this. in that actually I suffered in ways that seemed to be a little bit worse than everybody else, which I know is a very self-centered perspective. But it felt that way. And I can't remember it not feeling that way. I felt that way in kindergarten. As they say, I didn't have a beer the first day of kindergarten, but I certainly could have used one. I mean, it was just, I can't go back into my memory system and tell you a time and place where I actually felt okay. That was not part of my experience. And it turns out that really what it was is that I have emotions, and for whatever reason, I had probably a higher degree of emotional empathy, and I just things affect me emotionally really, really easily. And I don't think that I'm alone in this at all. I think this is very much the case for most of us. So when we think about why, for example, mindfulness, I'm sure everybody knows this, mindfulness has become such a huge thing in our culture, and it happened really quickly. Like I was driving with Patrick, and I was like, oh, you guys have natural grocers here now, right? Mm-hmm. But if you go to natural grocers and you stand in line, you're going to see a mindfulness magazine. You know, like mindfulness magazine is on the rack at the Whole Food stores. Like I don't think Jack or Joseph Goldstein or any of these people ever thought that that was going to happen. Mm-hmm. That it's actually kind of mainstream now, and I think this is actually really good. People have a derogatory attitude about that. I think this is really quite good. And I think that this has surfaced and people are attracted to this idea of mindfulness because I think people, when we all get kind of strung out on the external world, we get strung out on our devices or drugs or alcohol or the job or money or the right neighborhood or all the stuff that gets you, right? The stuff that you think that when you get it, you're going to be happy. Do you know about this thing, this game? You get to a point where you're just like, I just don't think anything's going to do it. And then the internal world becomes much more interesting. You're like, oh, I wonder if there's anything going on in here that I wonder if there's more I could be doing rather than just trying to get the conditions out there lined up in just the right kind of way. And when we think about, and this is a very short history, this is like 40 years in America, this phenomenon has been a thing. And one of the reasons why I think this emotional business is so important is I think that what happened for a lot of people, especially in the 70s, kind of the beginning of American Buddhism, we have, the whole 60s peace and love thing, we have the Vietnam War, we had all of that kind of cultural turmoil go down, and then nothing kind of really great came out of that. And then the 70s emerged, and then you had these people getting interested in Buddhism and the idea of enlightenment. And I think a lot of people were initially drawn to Buddhism in Dharma practice because they thought, this is the vehicle. This is the way out of these emotions I don't want to feel. I want to be enlightened. I want to get a spiritual and emotional lobotomy. I don't want to feel shit. I want to be above I want to be above my humanity, which is exactly the exact opposite of what the Buddha teaches. But it's easy to get these ideas confused, isn't it? And so we have this whole culture and this whole kind of idea that liberation or enlightenment, which is a term I don't particularly care for, awakening, however you hold the Buddhist goal, somehow means no more bad feelings for me. And if I was doing it right, if I was good at meditation, if I kind of could get this spirituality business down, that if I practice very well, at some point in the game there's going to be some kind of event, right? Something's going to happen. And on the other side of that, everything's going to be great for me and I'm not going to have any more struggles. Do you know about this idea? Yeah, that's not going to work out for you at all. It's just not how it is. And then we wonder why we give ourselves such an unfair, hard time. Why we beat ourselves up because we don't practice as much as we should, or we still have difficult emotions, or we still do or say things to the people we care about that seem mean when we become emotional. And we just think that we're bad. I'm a bad person, why do I keep doing this? It's like, no, you're a human person, and you're going to have these emotional episodes, and you're actually neurobiologically designed to not interfere with your emotions because they're there for survival reasons. So for me, it was a huge game changer in my practice and really in my life when I started to be like, all right, I really need to rethink this whole thing. And I really need to get clear about these emotions and how they work and what they do, because this is clearly what's driving my suffering on multiple levels. And then the good news in all of this is actually Buddhist meditation techniques are the best vehicle to navigate that territory in. Mindfulness and metta and these heart practices. If you're going to go into the gnarly neighborhood of shame and sadness and anger, it's really great to have a meditation practice to drive in with. It's like you got like a Sherman tank. You're like, all right, I can get around in here. And to the untrained worldling, as the Buddha calls them, they can't even go in there. They just get spit out the other side. So this whole idea of a secular Dharma or integrating science into Dharma is really actually valuing both. That like, oh, there is a contemplative way of operating. And this contemplative way of operating is really, really the best way for me to better understand my somatic body and to better understand my emotions and to better understand what's going on in this kind of experience. Does that make sense? Are you with me? Because I think it's maybe a little bit of an overgeneralization, but sometimes I have to do that. But really this insight tradition, this Theravadan tradition, even Refuge and Against the Stream, many of you know that I came from that world, that sort of American Buddhism, there is this undercurrent of like trying to either explain emotions away intellectually, philosophically, or trying to believe that in some way we're going to actually be above them. Is a huge, huge trap. One that I have been guilty of. So I'm saying all this because I've done all of it and it's not panned out. That's where I'm coming from. So I encourage you to not do what I spent years trying to do. For example, I think I avoided sadness for about a decade. There were some side effects. I happened to be single for 9 out of 10 years during that decade. That's why I paid a $250 an hour person to have that conversation. You think there might be a connection between the lack of sadness and the single, lonely, and bored hanging out in the house? I'm like, oh, maybe. Maybe they're connected. So I want to do a practice, and the practice that I want to do is a practice called Metta Vipassana, which is some of you probably know that one of the things that's again a little problematic is that we've kind of, in some way, we've kind of categorized Buddhist meditation into sort of mindfulness practices and heart practices, and that's not bad or wrong. But they're different practices, and they have different techniques. But actually, what we really want to do is we want to actually integrate those practices. We want our mindfulness practice to be rooted in loving kindness, and we want our loving kindness practice to be rooted in mindfulness. So I have found a lot of benefit in really trying to integrate these practices in a kind of embodied, moment-to-moment kind of way. And so the easiest way to kind of give you an example of that is, really, Buddhist meditation is very simple. So you have basically a couple of ideas. You have, first of all, you have attention, which is your ability to pay attention. You're all familiar with attention. It's kind of a little pesky thing to pin down, but you do have it. And what you do is you take your attention and you place it on an object, such as the breath, right? What happens when you do that? Does it stay? No. Bring it back, put it back. Why won't it keep bringing it back? What the hell, man? This is so hard. So we have attention and we have an object, but there's another piece to the equation, which is the most important piece to the equation, is the attitude that I have about the fact that my attention doesn't stay where I want it. Is that a kind and friendly attitude? Is that a compassionate attitude? Or is that a judgmental, not good enough, not good at this, actually not really good at anything it turns out. And in fact, everything I try, I pretty much fail at. I don't even know why I even bother with anything. I guess I'll just go back to the breath. And then it's just like you just sit here and just like, I just can't wait for the insight timer bell to ring. You've done this. Not good. No, I don't want to say you're doing it. Now you're doing it wrong. Like, I know I'm doing it wrong. So there becomes this kind of moment where there's like, it's all good. So I have attention and I have an object. This is good. But this is just actually what's called concentration or focused attention. This is not liberation. Even the Buddha said concentration is a dead end practice. You got to start somewhere. The reason I do this is so I can see my mind wander. This is mindfulness. Ah, I'm not with the object. I'm not with my body. I'm not with my breath. Oh, I'm thinking again. That's called mindfulness. That's actually what you're practicing, I think. And then mindfulness, recognition, recognizes I'm not with the object. And then we implore effort. And we say, okay, well, you know, so minds wander, I'm just going to, friendly in a kind, friendly way, I'm going to reapply my attention, which is effort. So we have the meditation path cycles. We have concentration, we have mindfulness, we have effort, we have kindness. See, I'm already giving myself a hard time for the fact that I just did that. Because I dropped the stick, like capital crime. I didn't even break the nice glass table. It's wood. So this is good. This is good. This is good. It's all good. It doesn't matter. We're not trying to get good at paying attention to breathing. We're trying to get good at cultivating a kind and friendly relationship to ourselves. And this is just part of the mechanism in which that happens in. So the object is not as important as the attitude in which you're practicing. It is going to be, I guarantee you this, it will be way more beneficial for you in the quality of your life if you can sit quietly for 20 minutes and be kind to yourself, whether or not you even notice one breath or not. And then the practice just becomes more fluid, where there's like, okay, well, there's this and there's that. There's a whole range of things going on. Right? So we have object and we have attitude. And of course, we have a whole bunch of objects and a whole bunch of attitudes in our life. We have objects that we want. I want the object. I don't want the object. I feel entitled to have the object. I feel ashamed that I want the object. I want you to have the object. I don't want any objects. I want all the objects. I don't like this object. I shouldn't want this object. Why am I a person who doesn't want objects? This is it. This is all that's happening all the time. There's just the object that's arising and the attitude that you have towards it. Period. And you're like, no, there's got to be more. There's not more. This is sort of the mind 101. We make such a big mess out of it, don't we? Right? And so we want to learn through our metta vipassana practice that we can be more aware through mindfulness, we can be more recognizing of what it is that's arising in my experience. And then more aware of how is it that I'm meeting that experience. What's arising? How am I relating to it? What's arising? How am I relating to it? What's arising? How am I relating to it? Take that with you everywhere you go. Right? Totally not easy to do. Not that complicated, frankly. So when we start to practice in this kind of metta vipassana way, we want to kind of think about that as it's a little bit more complex than just getting good at paying attention to your body or your breath. Does that make sense? So why don't we do that for maybe 20 or 25 minutes or so. Okay, well, thank you for the practice. I often find that one of the best times to have a conversation or questions about meditation practice is just after doing it. So does anybody have any questions about what we just did about that practice, technique, or how to work with it, or just kind of some practice questions in general? I'd be happy to hear what they are. Yeah, please, Randy.
So I'm dealing with some emotional stuff that, just I sit there for a while and then some aspect of my life hits me and I just feel this emotional stuff. And I found that it's become a lot easier just to think, oh, okay, this is what it's like right now, and not feel like I have to come back to the phrases, right? So I don't know if that's something that's something that's been happening to me a lot more recently, and I just noticed that that's a different response than feeling like I have to come back to whatever the deal is. And
right.
So I don't know. Is that
well, there's a habit we can get into that's not bad or wrong, but you've been practicing for a while. Once you've been practicing for a while, we can find that one of the habits that we start doing is techniquing.
Yeah.
So everything becomes, well, you're like, I'm having an emotion. What's the technique to manage this? Or even going back to the phrase can almost be a kind of aversion. It's like, oh, if I go back to the phrase, maybe this will go away. Maybe if I'm loving kindness towards this sadness or whatever it is, maybe it will actually just go away because I don't really want to feel it. Right? And it can be kind of this diluted compassion of like, I totally care about you, and you gotta go. I'll care about you, then you'll leave, right? We're good? And it's not like we sit there thinking that, but it can kind of take that on, and that's where techniquing can become problematic because, so actually what you did, I think, is the right thing to do is to just do nothing, to recognize there's some somaticized emotion, and now you're done. Now the practice is, can I just sit with this without having to go at it with some left brain technique remedy? Because there can always be a little bit sliver of wanting to reassure or to fix or to get rid of that with a proper Buddhist technique. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
For me,
and also, could you say your name, please?
Oh, okay. I'm Shelley. I guess what's difficult is the physical pain and discomfort and how to deal with that. I guess that's the hardest thing for me, I think.
Yeah, physical pain and discomfort. What to do, right? Other than sitting in a way that feels supportive to the body. It's sort of the obvious thing to do, but sometimes there's just not much we can do. So it's, again, it's looking more at my attitude, or really what we would call an investigation of the pain, because I notice that for me, if I'm uninvestigated discomfort, everything's at unpleasant number 10. Like that's all I have. It's just like, I just have, this needs to stop. And then the more I'm with it, I'm like, well, okay, like my knees hurt a little bit, like, uninvestigated, usually discomfort and pain turns into sort of like, now I'm just sitting here waiting for the meditation to be over because my body hurts. And we don't practice with it. So part of it is trying to practice with it. And a lot of times what works in physical discomfort or pain is to look through the body and start to see where there is not pain. Like when I go on a retreat, I'm a pretty big guy, so like after like 2 or 3 days, my knees start to hurt. And so what I'll do is I'll titrate. I'll be like, well, you know what? 85% of my body feels great. But my attention bias, of course, we all have neurological negative attention bias. I can't let go of the fact that my knees hurt, and then how much better this moment would be. In fact, this retreat would be amazing if my knees didn't hurt. And then that becomes a fixed view, that becomes a belief. Now the moment, just all that's happening in the present moment is my knees hurt, and this sucks. And there's a whole range of other things going on that I'm not even interested in at all, because I can't let go of that clinging to that pain. Now, by investigating it and being more liberal and noticing experiences that are also happening, doesn't mean it's going to go away. It just means that you're spreading out your kind of mental and emotional energy in a more liberal way, and that it's going to become, it's going to get down to a reasonable volume. And even to the point where like, well, yeah, this is uncomfortable, but this is actually, I can do this. But watch out for that quick, like the pain switches on, the attitude switches on, and you're just dead in the water at that point. And then it's like, ring the bell, dude. Right?
Yeah.
So just watch out for that. And try to play with it a little bit more and check it out and go, what is it? Is it stabbing? Is it sharp? Does my neck hurt? Actually, my hands don't hurt, my feet don't hurt, my face doesn't. Actually, most of it doesn't hurt at all.
I'm Micah, and I'm pretty new to meditation, but one of the things that is kind of going through my head is after maybe 2/3 of the way through, I feel like I need to, just open my eyes and just take a break. But am I supposed to be drawing myself back into meditation quickly, or is it natural to just, take a second before drawing back into the rest of my meditation? I just don't.
What does take a break mean?
Take a break with.
What are you taking a break from?
Probably emotion or wherever my mind had been.
So sort of stop meditating for a few moments? Yeah, I would just actually be like, well, what does that even mean, right? Like, so it probably, so it sounds like what maybe is happening is when you're meditating, you're trying too hard or something. You're exerting a level of effort that seems to be too much to the point where like, I actually need to take a break. So there's a way in which maybe you can look at the moments before the needing of the break and go, what is going on in my experience that feels like I need a break from? Where's the too much trying happening? Is it that I'm trying to force my attention too strong to the object? Is it I just don't really want to be in this experience? I want to go to distraction, which is a sort of a common, probably the most common medicative device the mind has. It's just I just want to be distracted from what's going on. And so kind of just see if you can hang in there a little bit more and see what kind of information you can get before you sort of tap out, and see, well, can I go a little bit longer? What adjustments can I make that would not result in me needing a break, but that would actually result in me being able to continue what it is that I'm trying to do? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I get that, it's like, all right, enough already, kind of. And it probably happens like at a certain time, like so. If you sit for 30 minutes, that probably happens at like 17 minutes or something. It's like, you probably notice that you have a tolerance, right? You have a window of tolerance for how long you can sit, which actually will increase over time if you continue. I remember, 20 minutes seemed like eternity. Then you start sitting for an hour, you go on a retreat, like I was sitting at this retreat with a Buddhist monk several times, but at one point I sat with him for a month, and once a week we did a 5-hour sit once a week. And after that 45 minutes, I was like, please, dude. And I'd get up and I'd have all this confidence. I'm like, I sat, I mean, it was excruciating the whole time. But I did it. Sometimes there's a confidence sometimes that comes from just like staying with it a little bit more. It's what they call in workout resistance training. The more you work with that, the less resistant you become. Thank you. Anybody else? All right, let's move on. So where to start here? It's always a question, mindfulness or emotion, where to begin. So I want to start with emotion, and looking at it, so like just taking a little detour into science department, and that we actually know quite a lot about emotion, probably more so than we ever have. And it's actually this interesting thing, I'll put a little caveat in here. People who study emotions, like emotion researchers, don't agree on a lot of this stuff, and they're at actually very heated debate. And which is actually awesome, right? That the emotion researchers can't like get along, which is just more proof to the evidence of the fact that we need to work with these things. So one thing that makes the split, the sort of East-West or science-Dharma, is that like when we look into the Buddhist tradition, we look at, the Pali, the early Pali language, which is what this comes from, Pali, Sanskrit, all the way through Chinese, Tibetan. None of those languages have a term anywhere near what we call in English emotion. The term that comes in early Buddhism, and really in Buddhist tradition, is called chitta. You guys probably know bodhicitta, in mindfulness, in the third foundation, they call mindfulness of chitta, and it's translated as heart mind, or mind, which I don't find to be all that helpful. What is the heart mind? We would probably call it in our Western thinking sort of the cognitive, emotional component of our experience. And so the thing about emotions, if we pull that out into the science context, one thing that I want to say, a couple things I want to say that I want you to remember, and one of the things I want you to remember is we're not always emotional. Emotion is not present in every single moment, like a mental state, or an object, or an attitude, or consciousness, or awareness. There's certain factors and mental factors, like attention is always present, feeling is always present, perception is always present. There are aspects of our cognitive experience that are always happening. Emotion is not always happening, and it's mostly not happening. You're not emotional that often. Emotions happen in episodes. And so, I hear you laugh, you're like, oh yeah, I totally know that. And so that most people on any given day have anywhere from 5 to 7 to maybe upwards of 9 emotional episodes a day. And most of them probably you wouldn't categorize as an emotional episode. But usually if you think about it, almost every day there'll be some kind of event that happens. Like that event when you get home after a long day of work and you talk to your wife or your partner or friend, you always give them the story of, oh my God, you're not gonna believe what happened today. Every story that you have about what happened today is usually an emotional episode. Right? I got to work, you know what my boss did again? It's like, or I got an email, it's like all our stories are usually of an emotional episode. And so they happen episodically. And in those emotional episodes, two things that can happen is we categorize emotion in categories of being a constructive or destructive emotion. And so the reason I want to set that up is if you remember anything else, please remember this. We have got to get away from this language of negative and positive. Negative emotion, positive emotion is really, really a bad barometer to judge emotions, because negative emotions are bad, positive emotions are good. I gotta get rid of my negative emotions and I gotta have the positive emotions. That's just not realistic at all. So emotion has no qualitative value or no moral tone. They're not good, bad, otherwise. They have no, the word I would use is there's no qualitative value to emotion. Most people say, well, anger is a negative emotion. That's not true. Anger is an emotion. Sometimes there's a constructive outcome. Sometimes there's a destructive outcome. It can go either way at any time with any particular emotion. So the problem isn't anger is a negative emotion and I have to get rid of it. Now, for those of you who are in recovery, you're going to have the 12-step conditioning of anger and resentment are the number one offender, and they're bad and wrong, and I shouldn't get angry, because if I get angry, I'm going to relapse and ruin my life. And then what can happen over time is we can become very conflict avoidant, or we become very, very passive aggressive, or we can actually try to remove anger in a way that actually just causes new and different kind of problems. Right? So anger is not the problem. The question is, what is my relationship to the anger emotion? So inside an episode of anger, if I become angry, do I do or say something that I regret later? So you can diagnose, have you done something recently when you were angry that later on you regretted what you did or said? Or you regretted what you didn't do or say? That would be called a destructive, what we call a regrettable emotional episode. Does anybody have any regrettable emotional episodes? And it's because in the arising of that experience, we lost our mindfulness. The emotions are so intense and so strong that we oftentimes just react. And then the emotional episode goes away, and then we drive it home like, I can't believe I said that thing to my wife again, or I can't believe I did that, or I can't believe I didn't advocate for myself, I didn't advocate for myself again. People always take advantage of me at work. My boss is always getting me to do shit I don't want to do. Well, because you don't advocate for yourself, because you don't have the anger emotion in a constructive kind of way. Now, it can go either way. You can anger, I use anger because it's a good, easy one. Too much anger can be destructive. Anger, I explode, I outburst, this kind of easy analogy. But you can also have not enough anger can also be destructive. If I don't have enough anger, then I tend to get taken advantage of. I tend to be conflict avoidant. People get the best of me. I maybe end up in destructive relationships where I get taken advantage of constantly. That's because there's not enough of anger. It can also be destructive. So emotion can be hyperactive or hypoactive. Too much, not enough. And the 12 steps would be the parlance of sort of that 6th and 7th step, where the character defect, I hate that term, but is I have too much anger. The shortcoming is I don't have enough of it. So I'm out of balance with the emotion. And so the outcome would be destructive in this particular case. So when we look at anger is one of the universal emotions. There's 8 universal emotions: anger, fear, sadness, joy, contempt, disgust, shame, and surprise are the 8 universal emotions. Everybody on the planet has all 8. Evolution gave them to you. Whether you were born in Oklahoma City, Texas, or you were born on the Aboriginal tribes of Australia, you all have all 8. You experience the emotion physiologically the same. Every emotion has the same facial expression. Anger, sadness. Everybody makes that face when they're sad. So when we look at the field of science, we don't want to think about emotion so much in the psychology department. We want to think about it in evolutionary biology department. Is that emotions came online. They didn't all come online at the same time. Probably the first one that came online was fear. We have fear, the purpose of fear. So all emotions have a facial expression. They all have a physiological response, and they all have a purpose. And so the purpose of fear is to identify a threat. Anger, to go back to anger, the goal of anger, the reason we have anger is to overcome an obstacle. An obstacle arises in my experience. I need to overcome that obstacle for survival reasons. I need to use the anger emotion to do that. Do you have any obstacles in your life that you would like to overcome or remove? Couple, 2, 3? You're actually going to need to use the anger emotion to do that. And if you don't have enough of it, you're not going to be able, you're going to stay stuck in that kind of destructive procrastination style. Actually, to be honest with you, anger got me sober. I had one of those old school, old timer AA dudes in Boston. I got sober in Boston with the meanest old men you've ever met in your whole life. And I would show up at the meeting and I would run my mouth and be annoying to everybody in the room, which is what I did. And I would brag about how I had a day sober, and they would say to me, you know what, kid, you'll be drunk before the sun goes down. And they did this every day for like 6 months, and then all of a sudden I had 6 months. Because I would want to drink so bad, I was like, I can't drink because those guys will be right. You fucking crusty old man, I'm not drinking, I swear. I'm not doing it. And before you know it, I had 6 months. Because I was so angry. I don't necessarily recommend this strategy, but it did work. Because it was allowing me to overcome an obstacle that I was unable to. It's what I like to call the get shit done emotion. But it can also be too much. We can become too explosive and too aggressive in our anger, and we aren't unable to keep cool in that experience. Anger, also we could say, there's a theory to say, we could say to some degree that constructive anger looks a lot like what we call compassion. Because anger, the verbal quality of anger is basically saying, I care about this, and what's happening is not okay. Right? So the reason I get angry is because I actually care. And human beings wouldn't have gotten as far as we've gotten if we didn't have this thing that Charles Darwin called cooperation, which is at the basis of compassion. I'm angry and I care about you, and because I care, we're going to take an action that's going to be cooperative, that's going to allow us to get out of this dilemma, which of course back in the day was not getting eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. We live in a much different world now. But the anger emotion doesn't know that it's 2020 or 19 or whatever year it is. It still thinks you're back on the Serengeti trying to like outrun the saber-tooth. It doesn't have that information. So sometimes we become emotional internally. In the external environment, the emotion doesn't fit our expectation. Almost, not much of the time. Have you become emotional and looked around and gone like, I have no reason why I feel this? There is no evidence to suggest that the way I feel, and you know what? Emotions don't care about that at all. Emotion does not care about logic or reason or time. It just doesn't have that kind of left brain. So, big surprise that we struggle with these things so much, right? Big surprise. But when I learned this, when I studied this, when I thought all this out and I started to actually map the physiology of my own emotion, I was just like, yeah, these scientists are totally spot on. And I was so glad that I had a Dharma practice where I could actually be like, okay, what does anger feel like? It's fast, it's hot, it's intense, comes on quick, it's accompanied by whodunit and blaming and revenge and fixing. So that way, the more that we can kind of gather information about how the emotion shows up in our psychophysiological experience, then we know, then I'm angry. I'm angry right now. I need to be careful what I say and who I say it to. I need to be careful what I do right now because I'm angry right now. And when I'm angry, I don't always feel good about what I do and say. I need to bring mindfulness. I need to be aware I am angry. I need to be careful what I do and say. I need to reappraise this situation and be like, does the level of my anger actually match what's happening? Actually, not at all, Dave. You know, like the actual evidence in the anger that you're feeling are not even at all close. You know, it's still very unpleasant. That's the thing I think we really have to come to terms with. If I'm going to give you any bad news, emotions are very, very messy, and they're very, very complicated, and they're all very, very different. Anger and shame feel very different. That we say, oh, I'm emotional. Yes, you can say I'm emotional, but the emotions have their own story. They have their own legacy. They have their own physiology. To feel anger in my body and in my mind, and to feel shame are very, very, very different experiences. They're both emotional. I don't particularly care for either one of them. I don't like them. Are they going to stop happening? No. I need them. They have a purpose. A very important purpose. They're really part of our survival. And so when we, what we would call this actually really would be emotional intelligence. Are we intelligent around our emotional experiences, or do we just become emotional and then do shit? That's mostly what the humans are doing. If you take a quick look at the global landscape, people become emotional and then they do shit. And then when the shit that they did doesn't work out, they blame somebody else. Right? That's pretty much what we're all doing. Well, I mean, I wouldn't have done that if you didn't do the thing you did. I wouldn't have done the thing I did, so it's totally your fault. And that's destructive. Because one of the ways that we categorize an emotion being destructive, especially in the arena of human relationships, as soon as I'm unwilling to cooperate with you, as soon as we're done here, as soon as the relationship is over, as soon as I'm not willing to cooperate with you anymore, that's part of the criteria for destructive relationships or destructive emotions. This is primarily true in marriages. That if you do any research on marriage or divorce, as soon as there's contempt for the other person, it's really, really hard to save the relationship. As soon as you've developed a sort of moral superiority type of contempt, and this is true for almost any relationship, it's like there's no more cooperation. I'm right, you're wrong, you need to change, I'm fine the way I am, then it's really, really, really hard to recover. Whether it's a marriage or a friendship or a work relationship. And this is really why having, which I'll talk more about at the end, these really Brahma Vihara practices, the loving kindness and gratitude and compassion. Really the Buddhist idea of really constructive traits of ways to really navigate the emotional world is so important. Because we also, a lot of our wounding, a lot of our suffering has a kind of emotional imprint stamped on it. Right? And so if we look at the narrative of our suffering, it's usually characterized by a strong emotional stamp. And so the big ones would be sadness. What is my history of experiences in life? What are the things that have happened in my life that were really sad for me that I haven't really resolved? And they were actually so sad that I actually don't even want to do the sadness thing anymore. I don't do sadness. And so if I don't do sadness, I have to use a different emotion to regulate that sadness. And if I'm a man, probably going to go with anger, because anger is socially accepted for a male, typically speaking. So even to some degree, emotions are organized by gender. So it's much more socially acceptable for me to be angry than for a woman to be angry. And so we a lot of this stuff is just our conditioning. It's just that we learned, in our family system, we learned what emotions we could express and what emotions we couldn't express. And then when we start to practice and start to kind of get into the weeds on some of this stuff through mindfulness, you probably might have encountered at times you feel like, man, it's just a mess in here. Why is it so messy in here? And some of us have hyper emotional, some of us are hypo emotional, we're suppressing constantly, which can be I don't want to go down too far in the weeds, and it's another talk that I've been doing recently on what's called spiritual bypass, which is very common for Buddhist teachers to get into, where you can kind of get into this attitude of like, I don't feel these things anymore. or I'm sort of above all that thing, and I don't actually, there's so much suppression going on that it can masquerade as a kind of equanimity or a kind of evenness. So actually having access to your emotions is very important and also very healthy. So when we start to bring mindfulness, so mindfulness is actually sort of your best ally when we're talking about emotions, because we really want to be able to develop emotional intelligence. And to do that, we really, the foundations of mindfulness and the Buddhist teachings on mindfulness are really great teaching and way in which we can begin to really kind of get into the room of emotions. And as you probably know, where does the Buddha start in mindfulness practice? Does anybody know what the first foundation of mindfulness is?
Breath.
The breath and the body. Why does he start with the body? Emotions are embodied. Emotions are much more somatic than they are psychological. Emotions affect our psychological experience. They affect our thoughts, our perception, our cognitive function. But they're really, really more in our bodies than they are in our minds. So when the onset of emotion happens, when you have a triggering event in the onset of emotion, the first thing that happens is your nervous system and your vagal nerve and your physiology sort of lights up like a Christmas tree. And you become emotional. Now, when we think about triggering events and emotion, once a trigger is learned, this comes from science, I found this to be true. Once something triggers us, once a trigger is learned in the system, it cannot be unlearned. You cannot remove triggers. So if you're finding yourself trying to remove triggers, you should stop doing that because it's not going to work. What happens is you can decrease the intensity of the trigger, but what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to come triggered. The onset of emotion happens in now mindfulness. That's the kind of pecking order. There's really not much you can do about that. The onset of emotion happens in a 32nd of a second. And also, the scientists say, nature, evolution doesn't actually want you to be mindful during an emotional episode. Emotions are designed to override the prefrontal cortex because they're about survival. I don't have time to think, is that a saber-toothed tiger? Is he gonna eat me? Maybe I could be his homie, I could pet him, you can't be doing that, you just gotta go. So neurobiologically, emotions are designed to shut the mindfulness off because we're not supposed to be getting involved. So when we really start to try to do this, we have to have some, I find a lot of humility of I'm actually trying to learn something, to do something that I'm actually not really programmed to do, but I can do. And I think this is why I think the Buddha was such a brilliant person who actually realized in a very simple way that he, not only himself but others, he noticed that people suffered in ways that seems to be very unnecessary. Do you suffer emotionally in ways that seem to be very unnecessary? Why am I suffering about this? I don't even actually care. And then the question was to be able to come to the question of I wonder if there's something that we can do about that. And then we have this 2,500-year-old tradition rooted in this core Buddhist practice of mindfulness, where we learn to bring awareness to the body, to the breath, to the somatic experience. So that way we're learning to kind of monitor the system, so that way when the emotion trigger happens, it's almost like a check engine light. Now when the check engine light comes on your car, you're not screwed, but something's wrong, right? You need to kind of inquire what's going on here. So it's like triggering event, emotional onset, mindfulness. Now you actually have a kind of a chance if you can get that far. Right? We can kind of, and so then the question becomes, we want to be able to recognize when we've become emotional. And a lot of times we don't know that because we're so, in the Buddhist teachings on the second noble truth around clinging and craving and reactivity, is that when there's an emotional episode, we react. We get so caught up in this reactivity that the idea of bringing awareness to the process of the reactivity doesn't actually occur to us. Because there's a sense of urgency of like, I need to fix, I need to understand, I need to blame, I need to get rid of, there's such a needing to do something about urgency that with mindful awareness we can kind of go, whoa, wait a minute here. And of course we have these, it's not just anger, it's fear, it's sadness, it's disgust, it's contempt, it's shame. And so we don't always need to necessarily know what the emotion is. It's good if we do, but it's really important to just know, like, I am emotional right now. I don't know which one it is, but I know that I'm feeling it. And I just need to, because it also floods our perception in the way that we see things. And so when we try to blend this back around, so mindfulness, so there's a triggering event, there's an emotional onset, then there's mindfulness. There's mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of the feelings, the pleasant, unpleasant nature of the emotional experience, mindfulness of the mental phenomenon, the attitude of mind, the distraction, the aversion, the attachment, the confusion, the frustration, being able to know that stuff, being able to actually have what they call in neuroscience metacognitive awareness, an internal monitoring of like being able to monitor what's happening internally. That's always going to be really useful to do that, but it's not the end of the story. Being good at paying attention to your breath is not the end of the story. The end of the story is the mindfulness arises. The end of the story is I know that I've become emotional. I want to have choice. It's very interesting, this word choice, because I don't know about you, but when I become emotional, I don't usually choose what I do. I just kind of do some shit. And I hope that it works out. That's not great. That's not a great, way to go. But we want to have choice. And also, one of the things that I've been doing that's been very fascinating is I've been holding the science up against what's called the Abhidharma, which is the Buddhist teachings on Buddhist psychology. And there's lots of congruency. And in fact, even in the manual on Buddhist psychology, there's a mental factor called decision, which is, to me, decision and choice are the same thing. That's this ethically neutral mental factor that occasionally arises. And so if we have these triggering events and these emotional episodes and we have mindfulness, and then we get to choose what we do or say, that's almost the definition of freedom. It doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it's fun. It doesn't mean it's pleasant. In fact, it's almost always, frankly, a little bit of a pain in the ass. But it's this resilience, and it's this kind of idea that Goleman talks about in his latest book with Richard Davidson. The after becomes the before for the next during. So if I have these little successful emotional episodes, or a good meditation or anything, I have new information. So the next time I become emotional, I have another drop-down menu box. I say, whoa, wait a minute, last time this happened, I did this new behavior and it actually panned out pretty good for me. Maybe I'll do that one again. And then that after becomes the before for the next episode. And now you're actually creating this kind of positive feedback loop, this kind of dependent origination on steroids, where you're kind of like, you're training your experience to do something different and to do something new that's constructive. And every time you do the constructive thing, the percentage of you doing the constructive thing next time increases like a half point. Right? Which is not great, but pretty good. So the statistics at least are in your favor on some of this stuff. And so when I'll take some questions here, I don't want to talk the whole time. So the Buddhist map kind of for how do we embrace this as a lifestyle, which is to me kind of what, to me, Dharma, or the Eightfold Path as it's traditionally known, which is 8 things, which is too many things to talk about. but is this idea of how do I develop a lifestyle, a way of living in the world that's based on liberation, that's based on these moment-to-moment experiences every day where I can have these little small victories. And they don't have to be epic, these small liberated events throughout the day. I'm like, oh, I did pretty good on that. You know? I didn't assassinate the waitress because my eggs were cold. Or whatever. Whatever your favorite thing to do is to torture the humans. We don't have our thing. And so we have to be really kind of pretty clear about this, and I think, and I always make a big play for ethics, it's Sila Samadhi Panya. It's a system of training. It starts with, really, we want to have, we don't necessarily want to, but we want to consider that maybe it's a good idea if we try to live a life of harmlessness. When we look at the suffering in the world, when we look at all of the hard time people are having, do you really want to contribute to adding to more of it? Is it really going to help anybody? And this is where the emotion of contempt becomes very, very interesting. Because contempt is the most destructive emotion in the human system. And in fact, Paul Ekman, a guy who came up with a lot of this stuff, can't even think of any scenario where contempt can be constructive. Contempt is the experience of asserting superiority towards another person. It's, I'm better than you. It's a devaluing of the other person. Now, if we look at our culture and our world and even our political landscape, we don't have an anger problem. We have a contempt problem. I'm better than you. And I'll say this too, and I try to be very careful about this. Buddhists are as guilty as this today is long, because Buddhists can have this kind of moral superiority because we're the wise religion, we're the best religion. And I see so much Buddhist contemptuous stuff where it's like, oh yeah, those people. It's that attitude of those people. And if everybody's walking around doing those people, we're not going to get anywhere. So it's like, so is my loving kind, am I really living an unconditional way of being, or is my metta conditioned towards the people in my community that are thinking the same way that I think? Because then we're just doing the same things that we're accusing the other people of doing. But we're the better people, so it's okay if we do it. Right? This moral superiority business is insanely destructive. So if we really want to take this seriously, the sila, which is really kind of the way that I describe it, it's usually translated as morality or ethics, which is problematic, I think. But it's really the kind of discipline that we have to our own sense of integrity. So we don't want to necessarily ascribe to the Buddhist list of what their precepts are, or what we should or shouldn't be doing, or the 10 Commandments. We really need to feel into our own values. What are my values? What are your values? They're probably different. Everybody has different values. It's okay that our values are different, but what are they? And how much discipline do you have to adhere to your own values? Right? That's what's called cognitive balance or cognitive intelligence. Cognitive intelligence means that I have values, and if you watch the way that I live my life, they would be congruent. That's called cognitive intelligence. And it's a huge, huge aspect of the emotional intelligence movement. Of do you even know what your values are, or do you just ascribe to some list in some book that was written 3,000 years ago and go, yeah, I'm with that list? No, we have different values. We all do. We all should. And then sila is our own ability to adhere to our own sense of values. And of course, in the Buddhist tradition, we adhere to values of harmlessness and nonviolence, which aren't that hard of ideas to get behind. Nonviolence, harmlessness, generosity, kindness, not asking for a lot. But how well do I actually live up to those? Not always, but that's sila. That's what that practice is. It's a third of the practice. And it's maybe the most important part. Because if you don't have that, you don't have shit. Really. If you can't adhere to your own sense of values, then all this meditation and wisdom stuff is just a big waste of time, frankly. And the hypocrisy and sort of the way in which we can sort of it becomes a sort of moral superiority. I'm smarter than you, I'm better than you, I'm wiser than you, I know what's best, you don't. Now from this place of Sila, then we start to do the samadhi or the mindfulness from a place of integrity. Then we can practice, then we start watching our mind, because we, as they say, we've cleaned up the wreckage of the past. And this is one thing I am a big fan of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I always will be, because I learned Sila in Alcoholics Anonymous more than any other place I've ever been in my life. More than any Buddhist community, any simple therapy, anything at all. I learned in AA, man, you stop lying, you do the right thing. You just do the right thing, dude. You do the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing. And you know what? I'm very grateful for that. Because from that place, when I sit quietly by myself, I don't get barraged with guilt and remorse and shame and wish I hadn't done. To be honest with you, I can't tell you the last time I did something I really feel that bad about. It's been years. So when I sit quietly by myself, not much comes up in terms of that. I'm like, oh man, I really wish. I mean, I do to some degree, but never of epic proportions like I used to. And then, from that place, then the wisdom comes. All right? It comes after the Sila in the meditation. It doesn't come first. Because if it comes first, you're just a know-it-all. And nobody likes a know-it-all except for the know-it-all himself. Do you like people who know it all and tell you, you know what you ought to do? You know what you really ought to do? I've been watching you, and I think what you ought to do is, it's like, really, dude? It's just not, it doesn't go well. Then the wisdom comes out, and what comes out of the wisdom is the understanding that the discipline to my integrity is actually really important. And that actually, when we start to integrate emotion into this, we start to see that a lot of the regrettable things that we do, the harm that we cause, happens in an episode of emotion. When I'm in kind of a non-emotional state and I mostly feel good, I almost never say anything that I regret. It's amazing. But when the emotion comes on, it's just like, all my woundedness comes back. Nobody's trustworthy. Nobody loves me. The world isn't really safe. I should probably be more of an asshole to people because they're an asshole to me. All my woundedness just arises in that experience. And then trying to manage from that place is not easy. Unless I can recognize, I'm emotional right now. I probably need to pay attention. I need to be careful. So when we start to look at the Buddhist philosophy really works good with that, because we have these four truths of we want to become honest about the suffering in our life. We want to become honest about the challenges in our life. Really, is how honest can you be about how hard shit is? How honest? 50%, 75%? How many people can you be honest with? If you have 2 or 3 people in your life that you can be honest with about your suffering, you're doing better than 95% of the population, I guarantee it. How aware are you of the causes? How much information, how much data, how much awareness do you have about that which drives your suffering? How much optimism do you have? How much hope do you have that it can be other than that? Or this third noble truth, this nibbanic sensibility, like, oh yeah, I have agency here. And then from that place, we can kind of develop and start to live this liberation-based lifestyle where we know what our values are. A lot of people don't even know what their values are. We know what our values are. We have some level of discipline to adhering to those. And then from that place, this whole kind of mode of operating just kind of starts to just happen. And then it just becomes a natural awareness. It becomes just a way of operating that you don't have the doubt anymore. You don't question so much anymore. You just know. The Buddha talks about this, the unshakable faith. That I know what to do. I know what to do because it's the right. And so I find, I'll end this, I will take some questions. If you have any, I'm sure you do. This really, I think, beautiful balance of of taking what we've learned from science and psychology and therapy and trauma and recovery and all of the Western world has done a killer job of really, really helping us uncover what sort of drives our neuroses and really what's happening in our mind-body system. But that's not enough. But if you take the Buddhist contemplative practices as sort of the vehicle, right, to drive through that stuff, then you have this sort of secular Dharma way of which you're actually embracing all of what's available. And it turns out that, you know, that you can go to college now and study contemplative neuroscience, which is like the building in the university where it's full of neuroscientists and Buddhist monks talking about this shit. Going, yeah, well, I think you can actually do something about that. Like, it's actually, like, this is a thing. This contemplative neuroscience, it's really, really fascinating to me because, and a lot of what they're saying, a lot of what neuroscience is saying is that Buddhism was right. The Buddha was right about a lot of this stuff. And a lot of what the Buddhists are starting to realize is like, yeah, actually, we need the science because we don't have a great framework. We're operating on this Eastern ancient language, 2,500-year-old thing. We're like little Annie's secret decoder ring trying to figure out what these polytones. You know what I mean? Like, what does Sankara really mean? It's like, dude, just go with the science of emotions. It's good. We're trying to figure out some like dead language and what these terminologies mean because science answered it for you. So it's just really this really, you know, make a play for honest, open-minded, and willing. It turns out to be a pretty good system. So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to take up all the time. Thank you for your kind attention. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have, actually, any questions at all.
I'm really, really new to meditation and Dharma and all that.
Well, good. You don't have any bad habits now.
Oh, no, I wait. What I'd like to know a little bit about, just from your perspective, is the concept of loving kindness. And if you could maybe just talk about that from your perspective.
I could talk about it all night. Do you have a more specific question?
Not really.
Okay.
That's how young in my understanding.
So loving kindness comes from this word metta, which actually means something more like kind, friendliness, or cooperation. The word loving is actually an added thing, which creates a lot of problems for a lot of people. For me, it was because when I think of loving kindness, my mind goes to all of the unloving, kind things that happen in my life, and now I don't want to have the loving kindness because I've been so hurt by love. So if that's problematic, you can politely put the word loving aside because it's actually not in there. It's really meant to be an antidote to fear. And what metta does, actually, experientially, is it provides us, first of all, you already have it. We all already have it. Just like we have the 8 universal emotions, we all have the 4 Brahma Viharas. They're in there. Loving kindness, compassion, gratitude, and equanimity, you got them. They came on the hard drive. So we're not trying to make something. We're not trying to get something that we don't have. Metta, when experienced, the experience of metta is an internal locus of safety, an internal locus of ease, an internal idea that I'm actually okay regardless. Everything is perfect in the universe. I'm okay, just as I am. And when you have a metta transmission, when you actually have an energetic shift in your experience where that arises, you'll find that it's really quite nice. And so then metta becomes a practice. It becomes something that we can try to cultivate. But it has to start with us. It has to start with you. Otherwise, it's incomplete. Because a lot of people find it's easy to be kind to others, but we're really hard on ourselves. So if you find that you're hard on yourself, you probably need metta way more than you need mindfulness. So it's like looking in the mirror and being like, I fucking love you, dude. You know, that kind of thing. You know, and it's really not so much about a love again, but as much as it's a transformative experience of an internal, fearless safety. It's okay. I'm okay, just as I am. And when you practice it and you work with it and you start to have access to it, it becomes easier and easier to cultivate it, and it's a cultivation of the heart. Is that good?
Yes, it's excellent, and it makes perfect sense to me why I don't understand it now, because,
It's not a cognitive exercise.
well, okay.
I mean, it is, and it's metta is, the experience of metta is much more embodied than it is psychological. And you've probably experienced it many, many, many times in your life. You just didn't have a terminology for it. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't even be here. So you want to learn how to pay attention to it as much as you want to cultivate it. Yes, please.
I'm interested in this idea of content. You know, like you say, marriage falls apart when someone, you know, at this point it's almost irreconcilable. Someone starts to develop contempt for the other. But if one were to leave the situation, wouldn't one just create contempt again? Or can you move past a place of contempt?
Yeah, well, yes, you can, you know, and it's wired in. But what you want to be able to do with contempt is there's a kind of dichotomy between contempt and disgust. Now, I can be disgusted by any sensory information, by something I see, by something I smell. Disgust can be aimed at any sense door. Contempt is always about another person. So I can have I can be disgusted by somebody's behavior and not have contempt for them. I can be disgusted by the person who let their dog poop on the sidewalk, but not have contempt for the fact that they didn't pick it up. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I want to focus on the action, not the actor. I want to focus on what I'm not okay with what you're doing. I still value you. I actually still love you and I care about you, but you have to stop doing this thing. Right?
Right.
Because disgust is a strong word, but I've recognized that this is not okay. This behavior is not okay.
Yeah.
But instead of being like, this behavior is not okay, in fact, actually, you're not okay. So, and sometimes actually that has to happen too. But that can be done without contempt. That's pretty advanced skill, but it can be done. I mean, I have, some of you will probably pull into your database right now, but I have people in my life recently that I don't associate with anymore, that I still value and appreciate and love and care about, but don't talk to. Because I can have disgust for the behavior and be like, okay, this is not okay with me, this is not in line with my sila and my values, but I still wish you well. It's the contempt that makes it destructive, because it's like, not only is everything I said true, but now I'm just like, now, and you're actually a terrible human being. That's contempt. I can be like, you know, you're a person, I care about you, I appreciate you, and what you're doing is not okay, and I'm not going to participate anymore. I can have all that disgust and I can have that discernment, but I don't need to have the contempt. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Not easy to do, but totally possible.
Yes.
Yeah, man.
So I always get so fascinated. You go through these 8 emotions and, you know, they arise and you do this stuff. And my first thought is, I gotta go learn them all. I gotta learn how they feel and all this. And then I hear you say, it's like, yeah, but it's really just important to be aware. And so it's like, I have the mindfulness to know I'm being emotional. And you say, it's like, I don't even have to know which one it is, but and so then I'm like, crap, now I don't get to go spend all my time and energy and effort on a fruitless exercise. I just got to keep staying, doing the mindfulness crap, you know?
Well, you can do both.
Well, yeah, but I don't know that I got time for both, right? I don't know if I got energy and effort.
You don't not have time for both.
Yeah, but I got time to do the meditative part of this,
Yeah.
and to just be aware that I'm emotional. It sounds to me like if I can do that, I at least have an opportunity to even though I don't have the language and background to nail down what that is right now, having that awareness seems like enough to at least allow me some choice in what happens there. Is that true?
That's right. Ekman and the Dalai Lama both talk about this as 3 criteria. Very simple. Is A, you want to become aware. You want to recognize when you've become emotional. You want to be able to increase the gap between stimulus and response when you become emotional. Mindfulness. You want to be able to not totally do the stupid thing real quick. You want to buy a little bit of time.
Yeah.
And if you can do that, you'll be able to choose what you do when you become emotional. You don't need to know what the emotion is. You don't need to know what you do. There's a whole bunch of stuff you could know about. It might be helpful to know about, but you don't need to do this little successful, constructive outcome. You just need to have the mindfulness. Triggering event, onset of emotion, awareness. Okay. Stay in that awareness. Choice may or may not arise. You still might react to do some stupid shit, but that's okay. You'll have another emotional episode in an hour you can practice that one. You know what I mean? The world is pregnant with opportunity for this kind of work. It's not like you're like, oh man, I gotta wait till next summer. Like, 20 minutes from now, you'll be driving home going like this, who's this idiot in front of me?
Yeah, I will.
Yeah, so you'll have plenty of chances to.
Yeah, yeah. But if I understand you, that just simply doing an ongoing meditative practice helps me with the skill that's really critical to that, which is that recognition and just being able to tolerate being aware.
That's right. But it is also helpful to have this criteria of that emotions happen in episodes, and probably the trouble that you get into happens in those episodes. So you're starting to learn to pay attention to the emotional life in a way that maybe you hadn't before. So that way you're kind of clocking it at least a little bit more.
Yeah.
You know, so that way you have just that, even that just framework of knowing that you might find that will be helpful.
So, and if I did have the time and effort and energy and want to go spend some time learning about this, what would you recommend I go read?
There's a book called Destructive Emotions, which came out of the Dharma Conference in 2000. There's also a book called Emotions Revealed, which is by Paul Ekman. Neither book are fun to read at all, but they're both very, very interesting.
And they're both by Paul Ekman?
Paul Ekman is Emotions Revealed, and Destructive Emotions is Goleman, Danny Goleman. Both fascinating books, painful reading material. Most good books are boring to read. Yeah, Kathy?
And they want you to write on the cover.
So she was asking you questions about loving kindness, which for me, I always think about that as self-compassion, but I have a hard time doing the compassion I'm struggling with the difference between resentment and contempt, because every time I have a resentment, there's definitely contempt.
Yeah, well, resentment's not an emotion. Contempt is an emotion. Resentment is more of a psychological hook. You know, and resentment actually, if you look at the Greek, it means to re-feel. Resent. Resent means to re-feel. So I'm re-feeling something that pissed me off 10 years ago. Resentment, re-feeling that pain. Now you might have the resentment without the contempt, but you also might have the re-feeling, the triggering event that reminds you of the resentment, the person who you're resentful for, and the contempt towards them. You might have that whole system going. And if you have that going, it's going to be hard. Wow. So part of it can be, to dismantle that is trying to not devalue the person who created the resentment, having compassion for them, while acknowledging that what they did was not cool. And also the self-compassion of like, I'm done suffering. Like, how long are you going to suffer about that for? Like, what's the sentence on that? You get to choose what the sentence is on how long I'm going to suffer about this thing this person did. Because they don't care. They're driving around probably pissing everybody else off. You know, they're signing more people up, you know. So you can kind of explore that a little bit. But sometimes there'll be resentment without contempt, but sometimes there will be. And sometimes contempt towards another person will re-trigger all the resentments you've had in your life. And you start building a case against why everybody's, you know, terrible. And that happens about that quick. Contempt is really important to start monitoring, because it's really, the other thing about contempt that's sort of a bummer is it can kind of feel good. It can be kind of enjoyable. A lot of these destructive emotions can be, resentment can be very enjoyable. You know, kind of hating on people can be kind of what the Buddha calls the honey-tipped arrow. You're like, ooh, right? It's got that super good organic grass-fed honey with a rusty barbed wire underneath it. You're like, but it was so good. Ouch. Right? It's really what it is. It's the honey tipped arrow. And so, you know, we can start to kind of maybe feel into like, actually, this doesn't feel so good. Focus more on the arrow and less on the honey. It doesn't feel good to think poorly of other people. I think most of us can get there without trying too hard. If we can drop out of the thinking and more into the body, like, oh, ill will, not so good, not feeling so good for me.
That's it, drop out of the thinking and into the body, that's it.
Yeah. Because the thinking loves the honey. The mind doesn't get the arrow, the body gets the arrow. So you get this sort of mind-body problem, where your mind is guzzling honey, and your body's like, ow, 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 ow. I only know this from direct experience. I got a keg of honey and a crate of Band-Aids. Yeah, please take a couple more.
I'm Brandy. I really like what you were talking about, the choice. I haven't described it in that fashion, but a lot in my sitting song that we've been talking about, like I've noticed that coming to the fork in the road.
Yeah.
And singing. And man's still just picking that old stuff.
Yeah.
And so like, is that just because it's such like a new concept? You know, like, because we talk a lot about like the familiar versus the comfortable, you know. But it's been really interesting. And then a lot of times I'm not judgmental towards it, but it just still is what it is. Like I see the choice and I'm like, well, we're still doing what we do, you know.
Yeah.
We're still reacting instead of, you know.
Yeah, the familiar and the comfortable is okay analogy, but I think the better analogy is habituation. Is that you're habituated, as the Buddha would say, a tree that leans to the west will fall to the west. A tree that leans to the east will fall to the east. So when you say like, you know, the familiar, it's actually not so much familiar, it's the habituated process. That you're more inclined to go down that road. The less awareness you have, the more you're going to go. With more awareness, the more you're likely to go, what's down there? I don't know what the hell's down there, but I know what's down there. And so you're going to have, with more awareness comes more choice. With more mindfulness comes, you know, there's understood as there's 26 beautiful mental factors that arise in wholesome states of consciousness. Mindfulness is number one. And they say when mindfulness is present, and the stronger the mindfulness is, this whole 25 drop-down menu of beautiful mental factors co-arise with that. And so and that's going to give us more choice, more flexibility, you know, it's going to give us a whole range of really useful perceptual mechanisms that are going to help us get through there. And we're going to get it wrong sometimes. And that's okay. I mean, even the best baseball player hits the ball 3.5 out of 10 times.
That's a great one.
You know, and that's probably about the best you can hope for with this emotional shit. 3.5 out of 10, man, is Wade Boggs, man, just like, boom. Or out here we would say, Dale Murphy, maybe. He was the Midwest baseball player. Yeah, so you gotta cut yourself some slack. Yeah, Chris.
Change the subject. I think you're kind of uniquely qualified to discuss a little bit about the thinking that went behind creating the Oklahoma Dharma Collective, and this sort of macro trend that seems to be happening in American Buddhism, where groups are becoming occasionally disillusioned with their guiding teacher and are looking at ways of putting on Buddhist events without a teacher as a guide. And of course, we're in a position in Oklahoma where we don't have a guiding teacher.
Yeah, you're pretty lucky. You guys don't have any know-it-alls to come in here and fuck the whole thing up. I mean, I'll be gone on Sunday. If it doesn't go well, just don't call me back. Yeah, you are an organizing group. You choose who you like, and you choose to have the teachers come in and teach. But that's all they do. This whole the teacher runs the organization shit. There's no evidence to suggest that ever worked. You know? So having a collective, group conscious, if you will, that decides who we invite and who we don't invite, and who we bring back and who we don't bring. You have autonomy, which turns out to be kind of a nice thing. And a lot of people are doing that. San Francisco Dharma Collective are doing it, and they're crushing it because people want to go teach there because it's a good organization and they get treated well and they don't have to deal with all this, you know, like I came here, I'm teaching, like, you guys did a great job. This is, you know, the teachers should be teaching, they shouldn't be running organizations. Because then it gets messy. So this collective idea works really, really well, where you guys as a community get to decide. Maybe you get teachers from different traditions. You know, you do whatever you want. You know, people, Dharma teachers generally, you know, will come and do things if you know, and so you have that freedom, that choice to decide what you want your collective to look like. And you're not at the mercy of what some teacher thinks. And you shouldn't be at the mercy of what some teacher thinks. Right?
Billy.